Hi everyone, welcome to week 7 of this Introduction to Phonology at the Ludwig-Maximilians-Universität München. Today we're going to go into the second part of our discussion of rule ordering and look more deeply at some examples of so-called morphophonemic analysis, where our goal is essentially to construct a fairly extensive analysis of the alternations in the forms of stems and affixes that we encounter in words and how rules need to be ordered in those cases. Note here now that we're actually going to be 1 week behind our original schedule. So for today, there are really no readings which are relevant. And then going into week 8, I'll ask you to read chapter 9 of Hayes' textbook, the chapter on productivity. And then we'll try to catch up in week 9, in which I'll try to combine a couple of topics. So the current plan is that what was originally on the schedule for weeks 8 and 9 will be treated together in week 9, or as we go towards the end of the semester, perhaps we'll omit the lecture on tone and intonation at the end of the course. Concerning the homework assignments, the third homework assignment will be uploaded this week, this Wednesday on June 3rd, and it will be due a week later. And in a couple more weeks after that, towards the end of June, then the fourth homework assignment will be uploaded. Today, we're first going to talk about rule ordering more extensively and get something more of an idea of how to conduct morphophonemic analysis by looking at a case involving Brazilian Portuguese. The data was already on the handout last week, but I decided to postpone it to this week. And then we'll obtain a bit more practice carrying out morphophonemic analysis with some data from Karok, which is an indigenous language of North America, and Serbo-Croatian. Okay, let's come now to the first section on Brazilian Portuguese. Having read already chapter 8 of the textbook, you should have seen there the description of a sort of procedure for conducting morphophonemic analysis. Let's, before we dive into the data, let's think about what morphophonemic analysis is trying to achieve. Here, the overarching goal is to try to account for patterns of allomorphy through phonological processes. Now, you may think we've already been doing this to some extent, and that's true. Though usually we've been looking at fairly small, isolated cases. So instances, say, of just an alternation of one type in stems or an alternation of another type in, say, inflectional suffixes. But we haven't put together cases where we have large amounts of data with several different kinds of alternations where we need several different rules in order to account for all of the patterns. And the complexity of the rule system is going to be a big difference here, because we have to think about how the rules what rules we need in order to derive all of the different patterns of allomorphy that we see in the data. And we have to consider how those rules have to be correctly ordered. So being aware of the possible interactions between rules. So last week we talked about the notions of feeding, bleeding, counterfeeding, and counterbleeding among rules with some indented examples. And now we're actually going to see those types of rule interactions at work in this Brazilian Portuguese data. So the main point that I want to drive home with this data is really how exactly rules can interact with one another, and how we should sometimes try to apply both possible orderings of the rules in order to establish which ordering is the correct one for the language in question. And that, again, goes back to something that we have said from the beginning of the course, namely that testing derivations and alternative derivations that correspond to alternative hypotheses about how to analyze the data is always a good way to check whether the analysis that we are proposing indeed works the way we would expect. All right, let's come to the first set of data. So our objective here is to analyze, first of all, alternations in vowels that we see in the data set here. We're first going to identify what these alternations are, and then based on those alternations, of course, we want to try to choose an underlying representation for each root. So in this case, I've given us some derived forms of a number of nouns, some basic forms of a number of nouns, and then some forms that are built with various derivational suffixes. And I think in all cases, we'll just see two different allomorphs of each root. And we'll try to write some phonological rules that can work for those allomorphs. And it turns out that in this case, I think it's appropriate to talk of these rules as allophonic rules. So we'll write up some phonemicization diagrams as well. All right. Let's begin looking at this data, starting with the first data point. So here we have the word for party, festa, and when we add this derivational suffix here, we now have, I've given morpheme segmentations here, so this makes things a little bit easier for you. Let me copy perhaps the data over here so we can read it a bit more easily. So we have festa alongside picivu. So here immediately we see an alternation between the vowel e and the vowel, the vowel e and the vowel e. And so in here, this is our root fest. It has an inflectional suffix here, and then here's other derivational material. We also notice we have this other alternation here between, in the consonants as well, it looks like we have a T alternating with cha, or even the sequence ST alternating with the affricate cha. But we're going to ignore that for now and just concentrate on the vowels. Okay, looking at the next example, number 2, the word for chic, and the derived adjective elegance. We have chiqui and chiqueza. So I'm going to type up here the vowel alternations that we're observing. So we've so far seen an alternation between e and e, but in the root here, the root remains the same in both the base and derived form. So e remains e. And so this is a crucial point. So insofar as we've established that we have the correct morphological structure, we've identified the correct morphological structure, and we know that this is a root, and we see that this root isn't undergoing any alternations. The position of the stress we can see changes here in the, in the basic form, the stress is on the first syllable. In the derived form, it's on the second syllable, so no longer on the vowel that belongs to the root. But other than that, the form remains the same. And whenever you see a morpheme that doesn't alternate at all, when it consistently has the same form everywhere, the most reasonable thing is to say that, well, the underlying representation for that morpheme is exactly as it appears on the surface, and there simply are not any phonological processes in the language, at least that we've seen those so far, that cause this morpheme to be pronounced, to be realized differently on the surface. Okay, let's keep going, and I'll make a list of our underlying representations here as well, that namely what we think the underlying representations should be. We don't know yet what the underlying representation of the stem for the word party should be. Let's look at number 3. Here we have an alternation between a vowel A and a vowel E. So seka alongside sikura. So that's an alternation between A and E. Going on to 4, we see again the alternation between E and E, shaky and shikadu. On to number 5, we see an alternation between a and a schwa, saka, and sokolu. So there, that's a new alternation that we haven't yet encountered, an alternation between a and a schwa. In 6, we have an o, and in the root, which becomes an u, so shoki alongside shukadu. So the alternation there is between o and u. 7 shows an alternation between o and u, soku and sukechi. And finally, 8 shows that the vowel u, if there's a vowel u in the base form, it doesn't change in the derived form. So given that we have, now the thing we can observe about the position, about the vowels in the derived forms is that we can see in the stressed syllable in the derived forms, we have a full range of vowels. We have E, A, U, A, O, A, and O. So, and similarly, in the stressed syllable of the basic forms, we have all different possible vowels. I guess there are not any derived forms with the vowel E, but otherwise they're the same. So it actually looks to me like the vowels that occur under the stress, there are more different possible vowels which are possible in stressed syllables. Let's make this observation here, in stressed syllables. This is interesting. And furthermore, we see that in unstressed syllables, there is a more limited set of vowels. So for instance, the second syllable in the basic forms, we only see the vowels schwa, i, and u. And in the first syllable of the derived forms, we similarly only see the vowel i and schwa and the vowel u. So it looks like to me that in unstressed syllables, only the vowels e, u, the two high vowels, and the mid-central vowel schwa, are allowed. And based on these alternations, these patterns of alternation, we see, for instance, the two front mid-vowels, e and a, alternating with e, and the two back mid-vowels, o and u, alternating with u. It seems most reasonable to me to think that we're seeing an instance of neutralization. So we've seen in previous lectures cases of neutralization, for instance, in Russian and German, the neutralization of all types of obstruents to voiceless obstruents in word final position. In this case, it looks like we're seeing neutralization of mid-vowels with high vowels in unstressed syllables. So this means then that we should posit the following phoneme inventory. So all of the types of vowels that can occur in stressed syllables are underlying, and the vowels E and U can either be underlying, so we should add to our underlying representation, our list of underlying representations here, cases where we saw no alternation. So the word for juice, add U on the surface all the time. So E and U, those vowels can be underlying, but they can also be allophones of the different mid vowels in unstressed syllables. And the vowel A, we similarly see A only occurs in stressed syllables. So here in the word for sack, we have A in a stressed syllable, and in derived forms, the suffix ad here in these words, these past participles, checked and shocked, we have a in a stressed syllable. So it looks like in unstressed syllables, we have a schwa instead. So let's quickly show our phoneme diagrams. Let me try to draw those the relevant phoneme diagrams for us here. So if we have, for instance, the allophones a and e. Sorry, I should start over here. Let's clear this. From the phoneme, let's say a, for instance, this phoneme e has two possible realizations. It can be realized as a in stressed syllables, but as e in unstressed syllables. And interestingly, this E also can be, I'm going to do something a bit unusual here. Let me draw, say, here's the phoneme of the vowel E, the high front vowel E. It only has a single allophone, E, and also the phoneme E, the lower mid-central vowel, the lax mid vowel, sorry, has two allophones, one of which is E. We see that alternation, festa, dicivu, and its other allophone is equivalent to the underlying representation here. So notice that we're already working out a hypothesis about the underlying representations without having written up a rule. In fact, I've already kind of stated what a reasonable rule would be, right? If we've observed that we have this neutralization of mid front vowels and high front vowels all to the vowel E in unstressed syllables, then we precisely want a rule that says that all front vowels should merge in the vowel E in an unstressed syllable. And for the corresponding back vowels, U, O, and O, we will want to have a similar diagram. Okay, so let's close this for the moment. And maybe I'll clear those drawings. Okay, so what we actually see here then, under the rule given in 1, corresponds to what we observe going on with the mid vowels and the high vowels. Namely that vowels which are non-low, when they are unstressed, in an unstressed syllable, I'm adding the feature stress to our feature system for today, they will become high and tense. So notice that this rule is a bit unusual in that it doesn't have any environment stated. It just shows us that under certain conditions, something that has particular characteristics, particular sets of features, is going to be changed in some way. And this is because we're treating this feature stress as a property of the vowel itself and not a property of the environment. Now, as far as the alternation between a and schwa is concerned, the conditions are the same, namely when the vowel is unstressed, but there we need to say that a vowel which is low, namely a, turns into schwa when it's unstressed. So that will essentially account for the patterns of allomorphy that we see. So this means that in terms of setting up the underlying representations for each of the roots, we should simply put the form of the root as we see it in the basic form in this case. It happens to be true that the root as it occurs in the leftmost column is what we're going to choose as our underlying representation, but be careful not to fall into the trap of the leftmost column here. Remember, we've done some exercises that have shown us that data will not always be presented in a way such that the underlying form, the thing we want to choose as the underlying form, is always in the leftmost column. But that happens to be true in the way I've written up the data here. Okay, so we've already got an idea there, and if we wanted to be systematic, we could type up or copy in all of the, that doesn't look good, type up or copy in all of the rest of the underlying representations here. So we would have best, cheek, and the word for drought, sake, and so on. I won't do this systematically so that we can continue working. Actually, this might be a good point to take a short break now that we have these two processes in place before we go into the second part, in which we'll look at the phonemic status of coronal stops and affricates.